Season 8, Episode 12 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
I'm Mark Bishop.
And we are, of course, reading George Lakoff's Moral Politics, How Liberals and Conservatives Think. This time also, again, taking two chapters at once. Two models of Christianity and abortion. So we're getting in that section where he's taking specific cultural or political issues and describing them according to his weirdo ideas. This time it is Christianity, how he thinks the right and left perceives Christianity and practices it, and then, of course, abortion in that second chapter. I have a proposal for today.
Okay.
And that is that we very loosely describe what he's talking about here and just kind of talk about what we want to talk about in relation to Christianity and abortion. Because I mean, at this point, you know, as we've kind of been saying, he's just kind of saying the same things over and over. Yes. And us saying over and over that he's saying the same things over and over is probably not interesting to anyone who's listening to this. So we can loosely describe what he's talking about.
I was boring myself.
Well, that's good.
You know, have you ever bored yourself? Like you're in the middle of a conversation and you realize, I'm not even interested in what I'm saying.
No, I'm always saying interesting things.
Well, I'm so interesting, I have high standards.
That's great.
Yeah. And I was kind of having a similar thought to you, although we didn't talk about this, that what am I even going to say about this?
Yeah.
You know, and I was thinking, what this guy really did was he had like maybe a 20-page paper theory.
Yeah.
And he spread it out. We're now on to page 200, starting on 245.
Yes.
Of him saying the same bullshit.
Yes.
And now it's even worse because he's talking about...
And he's just so blatantly wrong about everything in Christianity.
Yes.
Or it's not necessarily even wrong to a degree. It's just so oversimplified that it has no value.
It's almost childlike in its simplicity.
Yes. So I will summarize this whole Christian chapter.
Sounds good. Do it. It'll take you 30 seconds.
A few sentences. So he says, conservatives, they rely on the God as a father metaphors. And that is true. There are a lot of God as a father metaphors. You reference like God as a king, God as stuff like that. Sure.
He's talking about Christian or conservative Christians versus liberal Christians. Yes. So that's what he's... Yeah.
And so then he goes on to say that, you know, then how they perceive Christianity is all about the moral accounting, right? The original sin gave us a huge moral debt, and now we have to work through it. We're just like counting our sins one against another. You know, again, that idea of like accounting morality. And so then he says, you know, that therefore emphasizes obedience, priority of moral strength, need for self-discipline and self-denial. Therefore, you're conservative. It's a very economic-based sort of Christian idea. Then he goes on to the nurturant parent Christianity, the liberal Christianity. He says about God's grace instead and how God is loving, how God is caring. You know, we don't deserve his grace. He just gives it to us freely, things like that. And therefore, we're just called to emulate God. You know, that's how we get to heaven. It's not about accounting every sin. It's about emulating his grace as a child would emulate a nurturant parent. And that is why, you know, the liberal Christians are good and the conservative Christians are bad. Essentially, he doesn't outright say that last point.
Yeah, that's a good summary. And so should we even talk about how?
I will say, and we can kind of go from here. I thought it was very interesting. He doesn't explicitly say it in this chapter, but he does in the next one. He assumes Catholics are liberal, which I thought was interesting because he's talking about those, and he says he lumps them in with. Let me see if I can find it. With those who emphasize communion.
Yes.
And he places them in the nurturant parent. I'll read this paragraph. He says, in those denominations of Christianity where communion is of great importance, communicants are brought at communion into God's presence. They're offered God's grace and accept it. In eating the wafer and drinking the wine that is symbolic of Christ's body and blood, so not talking exactly about Catholics there,
right.
They are incorporating the essence of Christ, nurturance, into themselves, and hence changing their own essence to become increasingly nurturant. And so he lumps Catholics really into that. And he says later in the abortion chapter, he says liberals, Catholics aside, believe abortion is good or whatever. So it's an interesting assumption there.
Well, he probably has a liberal Catholic friend or something.
Yeah.
Because he's so surface level understanding of Christianity and Catholicism and morality and reality that it's just, I don't know how I don't know. He must be so arrogant to think that to write this book and think that it's worthwhile.
Yeah. I'm baffled that this is the third edition.
Yes.
That there have been, even somebody thought that there was a need to republish this, not once, but twice, two extra times since the first publication.
So, yeah, I guess I'll say this about, you know, the thing that is so perplexing to me about Christianity, and I struggle with, is like the parable of the what's it called? The
This is great.
no, the son that goes off. What's that called?
Prodigal son.
Prodigal son.
Yes.
Ah, thank you. The parable of the prodigal son completely refutes his theory of the scorekeeping.
Yeah.
I mean, the prodigal son gets his inheritance early, and then he spends it on cocaine and hookers.
Yeah.
And maybe literally, but I guess they didn't have cocaine because they hadn't discovered the New World yet, but it would have been whatever their equivalent of cocaine is in the ancient, well, not ancient, I guess, Israel. Anyway,
wine.
Wine, but you got to figure he did something stronger than wine. And gambling or whatever, and he pissed it all away, and he comes back begging for a job. And his dad, which is the God figure, is so happy to have him back. Which I understand the story now much better as a father. Not that any of you are prodigal sons; you're all great sons, But for that story to be, to be told by Jesus, it's saying. And then, he basically reprimands his other son for saying, hey, man, I've been here all this whole time. And it just seems kind of unjust, especially if you're scorekeeping, and that's not ever any part of Christianity. I mean, it's just not part of it.
Yeah, and he frames it, he's like trying to put it in like a weird atheist, like sociological perspective. Because he's like, it forces you to try and act good. And even references that because he, assumes that everything in Christianity is just like made up for whatever. He talks about that in like the last day, like the final judgment. He's like, if you're morally accounting, then you can just sin the whole time, and at the very end, repent, and then you're good.
Yes.
But then the idea of the last judgment, counteracts that. That's why they came up with this idea, so that everybody has to constantly be on watch and always make sure their books are balanced, essentially.
Yes.
That's how more Christianity keeps its morals intact, is like forcing everyone to keep thinking about and trying to balance the books.
Yes.
But again, it's like what you mentioned. It's just not true.
Well, and also... I'm not going to quote or reference Tolkien, but I will reference the Blues Brothers, which was, what's his name? The preacher scene.
James Brown?
James Brown, he's preaching.
Yes.
He says, the Lord will come as a thief in the night. Mm-hmm. And so you got to be prepared at all times.
Yes.
And that is a strong message of Christianity. You can't just wait to ask for forgiveness until you're on your dying day, because the Lord will come like a thief in the night, and then too late. So if you're really going to be repentant, and of course his example of somebody waiting on purpose that encourages sinfulness is just so retarded. Because I mean that kind of repentance isn't true repentance. You're just like, I'm keeping score. Well, God's not keeping score. I mean, not according to Christianity, other than. You got repent center. I mean, everybody sins, but without actual repentance, you're toast, and it's a scary thing. But he completely just misunderstands Christian thought, conservative or liberal.
And I think that's a problem with a lot of people who are trying to talk about Christianity, is that they assume. I think a lot of the times they assume a lot of religions are like costumes. It's like something you can put on. It's like, well, you do that in your own time. But I think a lot of people don't realize if you're an actual believer in a religion, it's going to shape your entire worldview.
Correct.
Not just about, political or current event issue things, but just how you actually view like the nature of the world itself. If you really are, a practicer of that religion. And he just doesn't seem to get that. He's definitely in that camp of looking at things like they're just, sociological phenomena.
Right.
Where it's like, well, we just came up with this and it just kind of reflects, here on the material world and stuff like that. But he's just completely refusing to even acknowledge, the amount of depth that's there.
Yes.
And he kind of, very loosely grouping them into two categories does not do justice to any, Protestant denomination or anything at all, which is how differently, each group views the world and how they each view, the role of salvation. He breaks it down into two bad examples here that have been debated for thousands of years.
Well, I want to point out this, which I thought was really funny. On page 247, there's a subheading, what makes conservative Christians conservative? And his answer is, my guess is that what makes conservative Christians conservative is blah, blah, blah. And it's like, okay, why would anybody publish a book where the author says, my guess? I mean, why bother writing it down?
Yeah.
Why share that thought if all you're doing is guessing about people? And that's really what he's doing. He doesn't know what he's talking about.
And I think what's really telling about all of this, and I think a lot of people fall into this issue too when talking about religion, is just his like exclusion of Catholics. Because I think Catholics do kind of break the mold of a lot of different other groupings of Christians and stuff, because it's like, you have I think he's generally right that there are more conservative denominations and more progressive denominations, sure. But when you get to like the Catholics, they have teachings that are on both sides of, what we in America see as like the right and the left that aren't really up to that. And if he wanted to give a serious understanding of how religion functions within these systems, he should at least consider them a little bit, besides just brushing them aside, as he does in the section on abortion.
Yeah, like, except those people, we're not going to talk about them, even though it's the largest Christian denomination
in the world, yeah.
In the United States.
Yeah.
So, I have a question for you. Mm-hmm. I say this thing, and I think it's funny.
Okay.
But it's also maybe off-putting. So you talk about Catholicism and other Christians and stuff, and I'll talk to somebody who's not Catholic, they're Baptist or whatever, yes. And they'll say, two things I say, which I think are funny. The first one, which I know is kind of offensive, but I really enjoy saying it.
I think we've talked about this before.
Really? What is it?
Is it...
All right, you don't know.
Everybody's Catholic? It's just some...
Well, that's the second one. Yeah,
yes,
so
yes.
no, the first one is, say, well, I'm Baptist. I said, well, nobody's perfect. I love that. And they're like, what? What? And then the other one is, everybody's Catholic. It's just some of us don't know it yet.
Yes, yes.
And they're like, that kind of makes people's heads spin. Mm-hmm. Do you think that's offensive? The first one I know is kind of insulting.
Yes.
But it's intentionally, ribbing somebody. You can only do that, to people that and like.
Yes.
That type of thing. You're teasing them.
Yes.
What do you thought about the second one, though?
I mean, it's probably a little bit offensive.
Why is that?
I mean, it's kind of saying that when you die, you're going to find out that your way of life is wrong.
Oh, yeah, I didn't think about that. I just thought about now. It's the universal church. I always try to
because I think
incorporate into the Catholic Church is Catholic means all encompassing.
In the Greek.
Very yeah.
According to all,
yes.
Is what that means. But yeah, I think it can be interpreted as meaning like when you die, you're going to find out the way you lived your life was wrong.
That's funny.
Because that's kind of how I've interpreted a couple of the times that you've said it.
I'm going to keep saying it.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to stop you. Oh, my gosh.
But yeah, so I don't know what else we want to... I guess my bottom line on the liberal versus conservative Christians, I think he's missing the boat again about... Mm-hmm. But really, I think the big differential is the acceptance of the... religion as established by God, as opposed to the religion that people want and assert for themselves. Mm-hmm. Like the liberal churches insert their own morality, mm-hmm. or they make it subject to their own approval.
Yes,
and I think that's a real problem because then you have ever changing standards. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you see those churches kind of go off on these weird tangents, mm-hmm. And they eventually lose membership. I mean, they can gain membership in the short term, but then people just kind of fall away from them.
Why am I even a part of this if there's
right.
no strict guidelines on what even is a Christian or what isn't?
Well, really, you end up having recriminations because mm-hmm. you're going to end up splitting on some other issue, yeah. and there's no higher authority to say. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying that the Catholic Church's hierarchy is infallible, but there's certain doctrine that have been in place for 2,000 years and it shouldn't change, and it generally doesn't, on the big issues. You have different management type issues that change, and it's changed over time on some issues, but. I think when you get these other denominations, these Protestant denominations, if they don't have, especially if they're the left-wing ones, mm-hmm. where it's just like, oh, peace, love, and happiness, it's like, well, okay, who's peace and who's love and who's happy now? And I think they all end up falling off and they end up having splits and that kind of stuff because there's no absolute authority that says yes or no. Mm-hmm. Is it you're either part of it or not? The pro-choice Catholics. Well, they're not Catholics. Mm-hmm. The Pope, this Pope, and the last Pope, and the Pope before them. So it'd be John Paul, Benedict, and the current communist, Francis, have all said, you can't be Catholic if you're pro-abortion. Mm-hmm. It's just not It's just not a thing.
Yeah.
And so I think that's really helped the Catholic Church survive, especially the sex scandals and all that kind of stuff, because the church itself still stands for something, and I think it's starting to gain more widespread respect for that, and I think you're seeing people converting or at least respecting the Catholic Church, maybe not becoming Catholic, but I have seen locally and some sort of higher profile people converting to Catholicism, and I think it's mainly because we actually believe in something that'll stick. It's like it's like an island in the storm.
Yeah.
But you were mentioning something earlier that I think I might have touched on before. Maybe we haven't even talked about. Talking about like the Christian and the Jewish religion and the value of the individual. We were talking about that today in the car.
Jordan Peterson.
Yes.
That's what we were talking about. When I was talking, I've been listening to his Genesis series, and I'll repeat some of what I said to you earlier for our widespread audience. But I've been listening to that, and he makes some really interesting points, but I think he misses the mark a lot of the times because he's being fairly reductionist. He's just trying to analyze Genesis in terms like the human psyche, what it means for humanity, very like practical, materialist way of looking at it. And he was making a point that I think is very true, and is that the idea that we are made in the image and likeness of God, and that is what gives us our dignity, is absolutely foundational to the law in our country, to our system of law, because it says that humans have some inherent value because they have some amount of divinity within them, and that is what gives them, this equal treatment under the law. And if you get rid of that, you get rid of, most of our laws. You just can treat people however you want because you aren't going to respect that equal dignity that they all have because you've tried to remove anything that's more than just, what's in the present moment.
Right. I read, and I don't know if I mentioned this to you, I read an article in, there's a magazine I have a subscription to, which is really excellent. It was just First Things. And it's predominantly a Catholic publication, meaning Catholic writers, but there's also Jewish writers and other denominations, but it's talking about first principle types things, and some religious, some social, book reviews, poetry. So it's very much like the new Criterion, but less opera, less like we're highbrow. Yeah. But anyway, there's an article in it several months ago called "The Desecration of Man," which
I think you've talked to me about that.
So that, and now that I've read that, maybe I was thinking along those lines before, but I'll give this. I wish I could give him credit because but I can't remember the author. But ever since then, I'm seeing that everywhere. That's really a fundamental thing, which means like we're no longer considered that divinity, having some special characteristics that gives us an inherent value that cannot be taken away and it cannot be modified. We all have some inherent value, and then of course we have a responsibility to act consistently with that. But if you look at like all the public policy problems that we have today, I think it's all fundamentally because we don't value the individual as like a son and daughter of God. I mean, like for instance, the big controversy about trans people. Well, that's not an issue for people that believe in God and believe that we're being created in the image of God. Because, I mean, it's an issue in the sense that you'd recognize, well, I think it's like people don't want to be told they're wrong. It's like, well, you're wrong to think that your body, the way God created it, is not valuable. There's something wrong with the way you think of yourself, and we need to work on that rather than start lopping stuff off. And I hope all those doctors, if they don't end up in prison, that they at least get sued into bankruptcy for performing those surgeries, because it's just horrific. Yeah. And I think there's a really good chance of that too, because I think a lot of people are being told it's not happening. And I think that's why there's still some public support on the left side that they don't realize, oh my God, they really are doing this stuff to 13-year-olds and 14 and 15, 16-year-olds. I mean, it's crazy.
Well, it's either the message is, this isn't happening, or why do you care? Right? It's like, it's the idea of, how does this affect you? And you're describing exactly how it affects us. If you undermine that idea, then you're undermining the rest of everything in society. If you say that there's really nothing special about how we were created, about who we are as unique human beings, and I think you add in, a healthy dose of the relativism and the grouping of everybody by race or sex and stuff, and say, well, you're just in that group and you're going to think this way because of them. If you undermine that individual, dignity, that individual liberty,
Yes.
then you'd have nothing.
Yes.
You have absolutely nothing.
And I think that's the best argument against the death penalty. That we have that inherent value as an individual, creating the image of God, and there's some divinity there, and I think that's the strongest argument against it. But you never hear that from anti-death, almost never. You hear it from the crazy left-wing nuns as they rail about racial injustice and actual innocence claims of people that are just cold-blooded, terrible killers, and they do themselves a disservice by not. That the anti-death penalty people are always arguing actual innocence when that's not the issue. Okay, they've been proven guilty, and there's one that's going to be scheduled for later this year. The guy confessed to a whole bunch of people and found all this evidence of property that was stolen from the victim. I mean, they shouldn't have made that argument from the beginning in the trial. The argument I think that's more successful is this person has an inherent value no matter how bad the stuff is that they did. But maybe that wouldn't work as a trial strategy, but nobody seems to try it, which I think is a real disservice. But of course, you'd have to get your client's consent for that kind of defense.
Yeah.
But when you're defending, but at the same time, it's also the fundamental difference in the abortion debate, to segue into the next section.
Before we get to that,
Yes.
I had a couple more things I wanted to say
Oh,
about
I'm sorry.
the Christianity.
Yes.
No, that's all right.
Go ahead and knock yourself out.
I was going to say, touching on the idea of like the importance, politically, of a lot of those ideas. I just finished reading The Roots of American Order by Russell Kirk, which is right down there in the bottom of my bookshelf. But I read that, and I think that's kind of it. It's probable that's where Jordan Peterson got his idea of the importance of that for like American law, the dignity and everything, because that's a point that he makes, because he traces essentially the roots of American order from ancient Hebrew times with the Old Testament through the ancient Greek Roman world, through Christianity, through the Middle Ages, the development of English common law, up until what philosophers the founding fathers were looking at and stuff like that, and the current state of affairs. And that's really the main theme of all of his book is, what's important to American order. And I was looking up some information about him. He was a convert to Catholicism. I think he was some sort of Protestant. And he ends his book with a description of, so he kind of cuts off a lot of it, at the writing of the Constitution. He says, I'm not going to talk too much. I just want to focus on the roots. But then he brings up a little bit about the Civil War, and he mentions Orestes Brownson. Have you ever heard of him?
I don't know.
He was apparently an author at the time. He grew up, was like a precursor to sort of a Marxist. He was like a socialist type guy, crazy left wing. He moved around from a whole bunch of like the new like Protestant denominations that were popping up, the Unitarians, the Universalists and stuff like that, Congregationalists. And he was an interesting guy because he wrote, profusely throughout his whole life. And so you can kind of track, all of the sort of beliefs he's looking to. And he's always looking for some sort of idea of justice. And he found that first with those precursors to Marxism, that we need to do away with, private property and stuff like that to make everybody equal. And he eventually came to Catholicism. He was a convert to Catholicism in the mid, 19th century. And that is where he says that he found true order. If a society is going to stand, and he wrote about this in describing, the American way of life, you have to have some foundation on a true, lasting sense of morality. And he found that in the Catholic Church. Yes. And he says that's really the only one that can do it, because they're the only one that has that staying power that says, these things are eternal and they're going to last forever. And Russell Kirk is ending his book sort of talking about, the separation of church and state and why it's not really what people claim it is, which is just a complete, we don't want any morality in our government. He says, it's sort of the idea of like the two swords, all the way back in the 500s, 400s, 500s, where it's like, we need a church and we need a state. It's just that the state and the church do not need to be the same thing.
Correct.
Right? The state or the church does not need to have the political power, and the state does not need to be telling the church what to do. But those are both vital things. He says Americans understood that for hundreds of years, 150 years even before the Revolutionary War, and they understood it for 150 years after. But it's just now as we're kind of starting to see, if you start to really separate those things and say that everybody is just free to do whatever they want, there's no morality, then the whole state's going to fall apart.
Yes.
And to bring things back to our Protestant versus Catholic thing, I think where Protestant denominations end up is one of two places. They either go, like you were saying, where just anybody can do whatever they want, there's really no sense of morality, or they end up instituting some system that's a lot more similar to the Catholic system than they'd like to admit, where they have to say, well, we have to have some body that says, well, this is how things need to be interpreted. This is how the moral system works. And so they say, well, we don't want any hierarchy, any authority. You know, I'm kind of, paraphrasing, Protestant beliefs, but they'll have to have something.
Well, like the Southern Baptist Convention, they just met, I think certainly last month, and they were dealing with the female minister issue, because and I don't know what their resolution was, because there's a lot of them that are really opposed to it for the same reasons.
Well, I know the Methodists just split over that big time, especially the Methodists in Africa and stuff like that. And it's like you either have those huge splits where everybody just kind of goes to one or the other, or you have to have some sort of hierarchical body that says, well, either you believe this or you're not a Lutheran, or you believe this, you're not a Baptist, believe this, you're not a Methodist, whatever you want to say. You have to have something that resembles that hierarchical structure that says this is the way the religion's going to function, or you're just not part of our religion, because otherwise the religion means nothing.
Yes. Yeah. True. Interesting.
All right. I guess we can move on to
I had other thoughts, but now I've lost them.
I'm sorry.
The ether.
You'll find them eventually. Should we start talking about his chapter on abortion?
Yeah, sure. So I was going to segue rather smoothly.
Yes. Well, I had more to say. I thought my thoughts were good.
No, they were good. They're good. Absolutely. I'm just teasing you. I think, and of course the author, I don't know what his summary was. It was. I think his. It was the conservatives used the term baby to manipulate and a strict father, blah blah blah, to humanize the unhuman unborn child.
I think his description was a little more accurate than the Christianity section. I mean, that's a low bar, but I do think he gets some things right unintentionally, because he's talking about what does the left believe, and he's essentially trying to give them a boost by saying, well, they just operate on science and they're working on hard fact, and he goes through like several of the phases of development, like the embryo to fetus. One of the things that stuck out to me, let me see if I can see it, the terms embryo and fetus call up a medical context. But he says an embryo is aborted in the 7th week. A living, organized group of cells that is not a recognizable form of the species has been removed from the uterus.
Right.
And I think that insertion of the recognizable, I think, is so telling, because he says, well, it's all medical, all medical. Recognizable is not like a medical thing at all. And I think that's, where he falls apart. And I think a lot of the abortion people fall apart is, well, it has human DNA. That means it's a recognizable part of the species.
Some people claim that the description of the fetus as a baby is just a cynical use of the term to punish single mothers, essentially, to make them carry to term. But he doesn't make the same allegation about the cynicism of the liberals who just want to have abortion on demand as a form of birth control without considering the moral and ethical and societal implications of those decisions. But so he's basically saying that they want to nurture the mother, and so they don't want to force the mother to give birth. You wouldn't call him mother yet, but whatever. And so I think that's his summary.
Yeah,
like the conservative Christians or conservatives who don't like abortion are really kind of cynical, and they just want to punish people for having out of wedlock births, because
he says if you
dirty whores, and they just use the term baby in a cynical way to manipulate people.
Because his argument is that the reason they're opposed is because abortion allows for other bad things. It's essentially saying we don't like unplanned pregnancies, therefore abortion is evil.
And he says he implies that conservatives don't care about babies because they don't support every single social program that can be dreamed up by the left. Yeah. And if you don't support all that, then you must hate children. So that's his view. But anyway, my point I was going to make about this desecration of man is really that the abortion issue is 100% that you either care about and value a baby once it's conceived, or you don't. And I just don't know that there's any other way to look at it. I mean, from my perspective, but unless you're going to try to dehumanize the baby.
Yeah.
And he likes to equate the death penalty and abortion issues. And I think there's some overlap, because if you're going to say that you value all human life equally, then you're not going to be in favor of the death penalty. If you make a distinction that you're supporting all innocent life as a government policy, then you can make a distinction. So I don't know what your thoughts if we wanted to talk in detail about the abortion issue, but it's it is kind of interesting. I mentioned to you I watched some of the recent podcasts with Donald Trump and asked him about a federal abortion ban. And he gave the most detailed answer I've heard him give yet about it. He says, look, of course, he praised himself. He says, we've been trying to, this has been the law of the land for 50 years, and I got it done. Nobody thought I can get it done. I got it done. I got it done better than everybody else. And I got these, because he got the 3 Supreme Court justices on there, and they actually did vote to overturn Roe v. Wade, which every honest lawyer knows Roe v. Wade was a crap decision. It didn't make any sense logically or legally. But whatever. But the question is, well, you're pro-life, blah, blah, blah. Are you going to support a 50-state ban, whatever that may be? And he said, no. He said, we've been fighting this thing for decades and decades, with always under the theory that it's a state law issue, a criminal law issue, and it should be decided by the states. And the federal government shouldn't be either banning it or approving it in every 50 state. And you know what? I think he's absolutely right. I don't think it's except for there is an argument that it's a civil right, just like all the other civil rights statutes we have. If you have a civil right to not be discriminated against because of your race or color or creed or whatever, don't you have a civil right to be born? And so I think that argument's compelling. But I think politically, I think he's 100% right. The people are not prepared for it to flip that much immediately. I think there's going to be a big mess for the next few years with different initiatives in different states and different regulations, some being really restrictive and some being very permissive. And then we're going to have to hash it out over the next 10 years.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about abortion?
I mean, I think that's true in a political sense, that I don't think it's possible right now, just practically speaking, to institute a ban. I don't think we can have such a core issue be so different state to state. Because it is, I think what you're saying is kind of right on like the civil rights thing, is like if you have a right to these other things, surely the right to life is foundational. And as we were kind of talking earlier, the understanding of human life is something that needs to be shared across everybody in a country.
Yes.
And I think we might have talked about this before, but if you have wildly different things, across state lines, then it's essentially saying, we here, in California, define human life differently than we do here in Missouri.
Correct.
And I don't think that's not a system that you can have for a very long period of time. Because if you're saying, state by state, we don't even agree on what human life is, we don't agree on the value of human life, on necessarily what that is, then you're just going to be completely at odds with each other, and it's going to lead to I think, irreconcilable differences. So I think we need some sort of national platform either way. I mean, of course, mine would be to ban abortion, completely. And I don't think that's practical right now, but I also don't think the alternative is practical either in the long term.
In the long term, and I think perhaps the solution is just to declare that you're a United States citizen upon conception. And that would certainly bring it to a head sooner rather than later. But I don't know. I don't know where it's going to end up because the people that are the politicians. This kind of gets back to the religion. This is the other thing it did come back out of the ether. I have completely flipped my view about the importance of my elected representatives having religious views.
Really?
I used to, in my 20s and 30s, think, what do I care? As long as they're doing a good job. But now I think if you don't have a religious belief, then you don't value humans. You don't value them enough, I guess I should say, because you don't have that feeling that God created everybody and that everybody has value. If you don't have a religious belief that is consistent with those terms, I don't think you can do a good job. Yeah. Now, having said that, I don't know what these, I will say this, and this is probably a stupid thing to say, but I in a way believe that Donald Trump has is more devout with regard to those kind of issues than any recent president. And And the reason why I say that, he's a character, and he's got a long and tortured history of really depraved behavior, especially with women and all that kind of stuff, multiple marriages and all that kind of stuff. However, he does seem to he has a pathos. Is it a pathos? He seems to care about people and about the country. And maybe it's an act. Maybe I'm completely missing the boat. But I don't get that sense from, Biden, I think, is just a despicable human being. And I've said that from the beginning. I mean, back in the 80s when he first ran for president, he's just a terrible person. Mm-hmm. And Bill Clinton was an opportunist. Barack Obama, I don't know, does he have a religion? I mean, he went to that Reverend Wright's church. I mean, but when he was a president.
I mean, technically he was Muslim, wasn't he?
No.
Okay.
Well, yes, he was, I think, because he talks about the beauty of the call to prayer when he was living in Pakistan.
Mm-hmm.
He lived in Pakistan
Muslim,
for a while.
weren't they?
His father, his stepfather, Barry Soweto, who was, I don't know if his first name was Barry, his father, his stepfather. So his natural father was from Africa. Mm-hmm. And went to university with his mother.
Yes.
And then went back to Africa. And so she married this Soweto guy who was from Indonesia. Mm-hmm. And so Obama did live there for a period of time. Right. And he was Muslim. But I don't know that...
I knew Islam was in his family.
For sure.
I don't think he was.
Well, I think he's just
he was really
agnostic or atheist. I don't think he had a religious belief other than a supreme belief in himself. And then... you talk about George Bush. He talked a good game, but I don't know. I don't know if he really, if he really had the same kind of conviction about those things.
Well, I mean, it's exactly what we were talking about with Orestes Brownson earlier. Mm-hmm. It's like if you don't have that critical belief, we're not going to produce good statesmen. We're not going to produce a united country. And what Russell Kirk talks about in the separation of church and state, wasn't, again, as I mentioned earlier, wasn't so much, we want to allow for religious differences. But it was, a foundationally Christian country. They assumed that everybody would kind of be Christian and in this Christian worldview. Yes. And it's like, we want to have differences upon Christian denomination. There were minority Catholics, you had the Episcopalians, and you had, several other sects popping up here and there. Like, we can't limit their practice, but they all shared at least a similar fundamental worldview. Yes. But if we get into the state where, we completely divorce the two, then it's just, we're not going to really have a reasonable country.
Yeah. I found that a lot of the politicians I really like are Catholic. Yeah. And I like them first. And I'm like, they're Catholic. Mm-hmm. Like Eric Schmidt, I think he's Catholic.
He is.
Is Hawley's Catholic?
He's not.
Oh, he's not. I thought he was for some reason.
I mean, I have a suspicion that he is leaning that way. But he goes. I looked this up at one point in time. But he's like a member of I don't think it's non-denominational. I think it is a denominational church, but I forget which one. But officially registered at some church in Columbia.
Was J.D. Vance? Is he Catholic? He seems Catholic.
That's a good question. I'll look that up as you're talking.
Who else was I thinking that I was really like different commentators. I was thinking, it's like
Michael Knowles is Catholic. Matt Walsh is Catholic.
Matt Walsh is funny.
I'm trying to think of a couple others that I know off the top of my head.
What was he just went on a rant about some random subject, and it was so funny. He picks up was he on the Pitbull thing recently?
Oh, they've all been, all the Daily Wire people in the past, about how we should ban pit bulls or something. Yeah.
And there's another.
J.D. Vance is a convert to Catholicism.
Oh, there you go. I think we should have nothing but we should try for the next 10 years to have nothing but Catholic elected officials. See how it goes. Everybody else is banned. I'm just joking, of course, but I do think if you don't have those kind of views, you don't have some sort of core belief that it can withstand the storm, so to speak. Mm-hmm. But having said that, I'm reading this history of the Civil War, great book by. I lost his name. Foote, I think his last name. Yeah, Foote. And it's amazing. He really tells the story from both sides. Yeah. And it's just amazing to me how devoutly religious the Southern politicians and generals were. How much they'd pray before battle. How much they pray before a decision. The prayers are in their speeches. It just strikes me so odd, that you truly believe God's on your side when you're really fighting so that you can enslave people. It's like, no, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but it's not too much more complicated than that.
I don't want to keep talking about Russell Kirk, but he's on my mind because I was reading him just before we started recording. But he makes that point about, the Civil War with Robert E. Lee, because he was, personally opposed to slavery.
Yes.
There was a good chance he would have fought for the Union side, but he felt more loyalty to Virginia.
For sure.
And it's that idea of like, well, there were good statesmen, there were good leaders who were on that side, and again, it's they probably were not fighting, they clearly weren't fighting for the winning side, but it's that idea of we just wholeheartedly demonize all of those people. I think at least a lot of people do, without recognizing that there were some good people, on that side.
Well, yeah, especially like the soldiers who were just fighting the war. Like they felt patriotic, and the way it was framed to the public and the average person is that it's an independence, it's a second revolution, and so they're declaring their independence from Washington and the North. And then the North is invading them. Yeah, initially Kirk, they play defense initially, so they can cultivate that myth or that story, and only later ended up crossing the border.
And that's what Kirk makes the point of. He says they're fundamentally mistaken about what American liberty meant and things like that, and that wasn't just the states have complete authority over whatever, and there's no central government. That's kind of how it was framed to them.
Yes.
But he's like they weren't fighting just because they were evil people, as you kind of see now. But it's like they had some sort of idea of something beyond that, or some loyalty that they had, and it wasn't just we want to keep slaves, right? Which is what a lot of people think it is now.
Yeah. Well, there's such a small percentage of people had slaves.
Yeah.
It's it kind of ties into all the modern day reparations BS too. But anyway, I don't know if there's anything else you want to mention about abortion or Christianity in America.
No,
or Lakoff.
Yeah, Lakoff is a character here. I don't even know how many chapters we have next. The next one is titled "How Can You Love Your Country and Hate Your Government?" So that'd be a good one.
Should I have a list in alphabetical order or by order of importance?
I think his list will be 100% different than yours. At least that's for sure.
Really?
I don't think you guys will agree at all. I think he'll come up with something obnoxious, is what he'll do.
I can do that.
Well, yours is obnoxious in a different flavor. His is obnoxious because he's stupid. But yeah, and unless you have any other thoughts, but I thought this was at least a good conversation, even if we didn't really talk about the book too much.
Yes.
All right. Well, this has been Season 8, Episode 12, I think, of Unlimited Opinions. I've been Adam Bishop.
I am still Mark Bishop.
And you can, of course, follow us on Twitter at ULMTD Opinions.